Hey, are you tired of the left and right politics? I hope you'll subscribe to my YouTube channel. Just click that subscribe button, ring the little bell, and prepare to free your mind from the traditional red versus blue. Recent headline from the Wall Street Journal caught my eye. It said this: Trump-Biden was the worst presidential polling miss in 40 years, so says panel. The panel was a panel of the American Association for Public Opinion Research. Dr. Joshua Clinton from Vanderbilt University, where he's a political scientist, then joined me on the program, and we talked about how this was the worst miss among pollsters since 1980. In other words, if you go back to 1980, I hope I can say this with clarity, the pollsters underestimated Ronald Reagan by 6 points on average, round numbers. In 2020, similarly underestimated Donald Trump by 4 points, similar to what occurred in 2016. And it raises a question as to, well, why did the pollsters do so poorly in the last two cycles pertaining to Donald Trump? It's not just this group that has come to a conclusion like this. Let me also point out that March 25th, Nate Silver of the 538 blog released a detailed analysis of his own. It was "The Death of Polling is Greatly Exaggerated." That was his headline. And I took note of the fact that he had a great body of data contained in this piece, including a chart under the headline, "Which pollsters did best in 2020?" And in that grid, he had 25 of the biggest names in the business. So you've got Morning Consult, and you've got YouGov, and you've got SurveyMonkey, and you have Survey USA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Who did the best? He identifies two as having done the best: Atlas Intel, which had an average error of 2.2, and the Trafalgar Group, which was at 2.6. And then further along, and by the way, these are Nate Silver's words, let's give a shout out to the pollsters with the lowest average error. They were Atlas Intel and the Trafalgar Group. Further along, he said this: one more observation. Some of these pollsters probably deserve a bit more credit than they got. I say that even though there isn't a lot of love lost between 538 and at least one of these polling firms, Trafalgar Group. Trafalgar Group has major issues with transparency, for instance, and we've criticized them for it, but their polling was pretty good last cycle. And they didn't get a lot of credit for it because they happened to, quote unquote, call some of the close states wrong. These pollsters often showed Biden narrowly losing states such as Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania that he instead narrowly won. Nonetheless, a poll that showed, for example, Biden losing Pennsylvania by 2 points was actually slightly closer to the mark than one that had him winning by 7, given Biden's final margin of victory there, which was 1.2 points. So yes, in some cases, these pollsters were too bullish on Republicans, but not to the same extent that most other pollsters were too bullish on Democrats. Of course, one could argue that these polling firms got lucky in a different respect. If your polls are always Republican leaning, then you're going to look like a genius when the polling averages happen to miss Republican support. You'll be one of the worst performing pollsters in other cycles, however. I think that's a valid point, but only if a polling firm really does have a long track record of always leaning in the same direction. That's an apt description for Rasmussen, which has been Republican leaning for many years. Trafalgar Group, however, is relatively new. Their first entry in our polling database comes from the 2016 primaries. It's hard to criticize them too much when, at least in 2016 and 2020, they were correct to show better results for Trump than the consensus of other polls. And for what it's worth, the final Trafalgar Group polls also correctly showed Democrats winning the Georgia runoffs. So quite a bit of recognition for Trafalgar from Nate Silver, which brings me to Robert Cahaly from the Trafalgar Group. Hey, Robert, nice to have you back on the program. I really appreciate you being here.
Always good to be on Michael's show, and no question.
So Nate Silver gives you a shout out. What did you make of that?
Well, I took it with a little grain of salt at first because it's not something I expected. I've had my particular barbs with him back and forth on social media over the course of the election, and they've had some negative things to say. That they didn't like, for example, the fact that sometimes we put out a poll in a particular state with the presidential contest. We're doing that, and we do that for publicity, and no one pays for it. But a customer will pay us to put some additional questions that we provide the answers to them, and he thinks that's a lack of transparency. I think if nobody tells me how it should come out and they're not paying for the question I'm publicizing, it isn't. But that's a fair dispute. People are gonna have either side of that. But when you're probably your harshest critic has kind words to say, you should just take it with a little bit of humility. So I think that's what we did. We were very pleased. I mean, there were some errors in his article. We actually did not say that Trump would win Wisconsin. We had the #1 poll in Wisconsin. We said he would barely lose it. And we happen to have the #1 poll in Ohio, Texas, North Carolina, and Florida too. And so that it was quite an accomplishment for us to have that kind of recognition from the side that's been very critical. But the numbers are the numbers, and in the end, we can argue with people's motivations. But questioning Nate Silver as a statistician is not useful, and it's not accurate.
So, Robert, I interviewed Dr. Joshua Clinton from Vanderbilt explaining the analysis that showed that 2020 was the worst polling fail in 40 years. And he was a great guest, and he was terrific at explaining to us wherein were the deviations, but he really didn't have the explanation. What's your explanation as to why 2020 was such a difficult year for pollsters?
Well, it goes back into the whole concept of what we call the social desirability bias. And some people call that the Bradley effect, dating back to I think what's Bradley's first name?
Mayor Tom Bradley. Yeah, Mayor Tom Bradley running
California.
against George Duke-Majan.
Duke-Majan, that's right. And so the idea of people were saying they were going to vote for him that weren't because they didn't want to be judged by the person asking the question. So social desirability bias played a lot into it. It played a lot into 2016, but it shifted, and I'm going to tell you how it was different. In 2016, it was just straight up social desirability bias. People weren't willing to admit they were going to vote for Trump. Hillary called the Trump supporters deplorables, and there was a lot of characterization going on it. And there were people who said, "Hey, they look themselves in the mirror and they don't see the same kind of Trumpers that are in parades and raising Cain on the street corners, and they think, but I'm for Trump, so maybe I don't want to be cast that way." So they kind of kept that support quiet. By 2020, I think we see a different thing. And in 2020, we found in 2016 that you could literally just kind of move past to give them a little layer of anonymity, and you would get a more honest answer. In 2020, everybody was suspect of everything. Cancel culture has embraced to a degree that people are they don't know who's calling. I mean, it's really very suspect. Like, who are you calling? Why do you want to know? What are you doing with this information? Whether it's hacking, whether it's social media, people being doxxed, I think people are very nervous about expressing an opinion. So part of the problem in 2020 versus 16 is Republicans didn't want to talk. You had to, depending upon the state, 5, 6, 7 times as many Republicans as Democrats just to get an even representation, because Republicans did not want to share their opinion. So if you didn't go that extra mile to make sure that you got that right sample, and also realizing that Republicans who don't like Trump wanted to share their opinion. So you had an oversampling of the quote never Trumper types, and you had an undersampling of the people who were for Trump who just didn't want to tell anybody who they were for. So you had to consider all of that, and it's a little more difficult. And the basic premise that we always start with is people lie. People always have lied. We can't expect that they lie to their doctors, they lie to their priests, they lie to the accountants, and all of a sudden when they get on the phone, they become Honest Abe. It doesn't make sense. It never made sense. So we accept that people lie. And a guy I learned a lot from, a pollster back in South Carolina when I was growing up, was Rod Shealy. And you said, you got to give people a nice way to tell you something unpleasant.
So this panel that studied what went on in 2020 said one possibility of the error rate was that Democrats were more willing to answer polls than were Republicans. I think you've just addressed that. Alternatively, Republicans who were willing to talk to pollsters might have been those most open to supporting Mr. Biden, while Republicans who declined to be polled may have been more supportive of Donald Trump. I guess my question for Robert Cahaly is, how much of this issue is Trump specific? And if in 2024, Donald Trump is not running for president, as a pollster, will you still be contending with these issues?
First of all, it's not Trump specific. It was more Trump specific in 2016, but by 2018, which is a very interesting cycle, we had a nice little study in 2018. And in 2018, that study was Florida. In Florida, we measuring social desirability bias. When you look at the Rick Scott and Nelson Senate race, there was no social desirability. Nobody was hiding their vote. Our polls were exactly what it was. However, with DeSantis versus Gillum, there was about a 4 or 5% hidden vote. And so that is a reason that not only did we do well in 16 and 20, but we were the only firm in the country to call that DeSantis would win that race for governor. So there are hidden votes in other races. In 2020, people overestimated Jamie Harrison's support against Lindsey Graham. Everybody said it was going to be close. It wasn't close. So people hiding their support, the social desirability bias existed, during the days of Tom Brady. I mean, sorry, Tom
You're thinking of the Super Bowl quarterback.
Yeah, as a Cowboys fan, I should never say that. But no, whether it's the Tom Bradley race all the way to the modern era, we're going to have social desirability bias. Add to that a layer of skepticism in the system, in the polls. And, a lot of these people, Trump is out there telling people that the polls are, suppression polls. Well, there are a lot of people who are for Trump, then don't trust the polls and don't want to participate. There are a lot of people who are very nervous about who's collecting their data. We found it all the time. We'd have to give people a level of comfort that this was real. We had people stop and Google us while we were on the phone with them to say, is this a real polling company? Who are you? What do you want with this data? And so that skepticism isn't going away. The more cancel culture there is, the more stifling of speech that people feel, the more hesitant they are to tell the truth. And if you don't have a method to get around that, and you don't compensate for that and plan for that, I think you're going to continue having hurdles in the polling world.
Robert, two other questions. You just referenced former President Trump saying that these were suppression polls. Do you see any evidence that there was a deliberate effort by your competitors to exaggerate the Biden advantage so as to depress the Trump turnout?
Well, I always answer this two ways. I'm a believer that polls should reflect the electorate, not affect the electorate. So when you look at some of these that were so far off, and I mean, just, I think the example of Wisconsin was a good one, but, there were polling companies that never, ever showed a chance in Florida. And we figured out by the middle of October that Florida wasn't going to be close. Florida wasn't going to be 1 or 2 points. It was going to be higher than that. So, it either is that there was some sort of agenda, or they just, did a very bad job. The other thing, and Nate Silver speaks about this, is kind of what they call the in-house bias. That sometimes there's a bias that you don't realize is there, and whether it's in how you're modeling the turnout. So it might be that these groups were modeling a turnout that was very different than what they expected. And the one thing I will tell you that surprised me the most, the one difference in 2020 that I think could have resulted in the polls being so far off, is the traditional senior base that the Republicans have counted on to win by a larger percentage wasn't there due to COVID. And the traditional African American and Hispanic base that Democrats count on winning, 80-20 on the or better with the African American vote, or in the low 70s for the Hispanic vote, weren't there either, because we saw a lot of outperforming around the country with the Black and Hispanic vote. Now, again, a lot of those were hidden, and you won't see them in exit polls, because if you won't tell the truth on the phone, you're not going to tell the truth when you're walking out of a poll.
Okay, well, that brings me to my final question for Robert Cahaly from the Trafalgar Group. And again, thanks for your willingness to discuss this. The so-called, your words, social desirability bias. As I've listened to you tick off examples of who has it's been to the detriment of, whether it's Ronald Reagan, whether it's Lindsey Graham in the race that you described, whether it's in the race for governor of Florida, that you described with DeSantis and Gillum, when I think of Trump, both in 16 and in 20, it seems like it's always the Republican who is on the receiving end of that bias. And often it's the white candidate, i.e. the Bradley effect. Are there any races that come to mind where it's the Democrat, it's the person of color who's running in the Democratic Party who is disadvantaged by this bias?
I don't have any readily available, because part of this bias is the feeling that people have that they're going to be judged as being, a bigot or a racist. So, see, that doesn't work on the inverse way,
Right.
and so part of it is kind of baked into that. Now, what I have seen, and I actually saw this in the Democrat primary last time, is there are Democrats who consider themselves mainstream, who were for Sanders, who weren't willing to admit it because he had the socialist label. They intended to vote for him. They liked his policies, but they didn't want to be called a socialist. So it can go both directions, but social desirability bias based on, being judged in a more politically correct environment. I mean, political correctness doesn't go both ways. It's much more a progressive thing, and so that's part of why its impact is very one-sided.
Robert, thank you so much. I hope this is not selling you short when one of my takeaways is people lie to everybody else. Why wouldn't they lie to pollsters?
Absolutely, they certainly do lie to them, and if you don't learn how to figure out what they really want, what they really believe, versus what they're trying to, what they want to tell you on their face, then you're going to have trouble. But that's one of the beauties of being from the South. I'm used to people being very nice and not really meaning it.
Robert Cahaly, thank you.
Thank you.